August 7th, 1997. It was a cloudy and rainy morning in the city of Kaohsiung, Taiwan. I, along with my entire family, completed the last check-in procedures in the airport terminal before we were to embark on a trans-Pacific journey to a country called Canada. The airport was filled with excited travelers, eager to begin their holidays. I was not, dull-eyed and dragging my feet, wishing that today had never came. Today, the plane would take us to our new home some 7,000 miles away. Never to return, as my father said, a determination in his voice. I wept as we waved goodbye to the relatives who came to see us at the airport for the last time. Fate is cruel, I said to myself as my heart sank. As the plane taxied to the runway, tears continued to stream down my face. Outside, the rain was coming down in sheets, as if sympathizing with me. Even to this day, the memories of that fateful morning was etched deep into my mind, clear as crystal. It was the reflection of that day, which completely altered the course of my life, that became the inspiration for this lecture as I try to illustrate the parallels between my life and the life of the composer we will now examine. His name is Frederic Chopin. Chopin, with his nearly 100% brand awareness in the musical world, so to speak, was known by many for the pieces he composed for the piano. What is perhaps not as well known was the fact that he left his homeland as a young adult, just like I did. Chopin was born in the year 1810 in a small Polish village some 30 miles outside of Warsaw. He began his musical studies very early, and by age 6, he was already composing and taking lessons. Seeing the limited musical opportunities in Warsaw, Chopin traveled to Berlin and subsequently to Vienna in search of a more stable career. Initial successes prompted Chopin to make a second trip to the Austrian capital, only to be met with disappointments. It was around the same time that the news of the Polish revolt against the Russians was made known to him. At the urging of his family, however, he remained in Vienna even though he longed to fight for his country. He would later find out, unfortunately, that the revolt had been unsuccessful and that Warsaw had fallen into the hands of the Russians. Shortly after, he set out for Paris, which would become his home for the next 19 years before his death in 1849. He was never to return to Poland. At that point in time, Paris was considered as a European hub for culture, and thanks to some connections that he had, he quickly gained entrance to the musical scene in the city. It was there he met some of the most famous composers in the Romantic period, some of which included Franz Liszt, Hector Berlioz, Robert Schumann, and Felix Mendelssohn. In a sense, Paris was seen as a musical epicenter in Europe at that point in time. His musical performances were warmly received by the concertgoers in Paris, and he quickly became the highest-paid piano teachers in the city. Having worked his way up to the upper levels of the society, he was able to maintain a good living while staying away from the spotlight of the concert halls, which he disliked very much. He would prefer to play in more intimate settings such as salons and small gatherings. Chopin died at the young age of 39. His funeral was attended by some 3,000 people. He was buried in France, but his heart was interred in Warsaw, illustrating the fact that in his heart he will always belong to his homeland. While he was a composer born supposedly in the Romantic period, Chopin's musical inspirations were deeply rooted in the composers of the past. Bonita Eisler pointed out in this quote that his musical touchstones were those of Haydn, Mozart, but especially Bach. Notice that in that list of composers, Beethoven's name is evidently missing in that list, which was not all that surprising given Beethoven's rather progressive tendencies in composition, where Chopin prefers to composed in a more conservative and traditional way. One could perhaps extend this curiosity further and speculate that because of his stylistic affinity to the composers of the past, he must have been very aware of the fact that he was a Pole living away from home, which music became a natural vehicle for him to access his past. Chopin was very unique in that he wrote almost exclusively for the piano, and his piano music was renowned for their sublime beauty and vocal lyricism, which would not be surpassed again in the history of music. The inherent vocal qualities of many of his pieces came from his love of opera, especially those of the Italian composer Bellini. He went into the opera house actually almost every night when he was in Paris, and many have remarked that his pieces made the piano sound like a human voice. The two genres that most directly illustrates his connection to Polish music would be the Mazurka and the Polonaise. Both of these will be discussed more in detail later on. What's really interesting is Chopin actually wrote many of these Polonaises and Mazurkas after he arrived in Paris. So he was essentially recalling a tradition from his younger years that he could remember while he was in Poland. And so that kind of music came mostly from the music that he heard in the salons in Warsaw. One interesting characteristic that pervades many of Chopin's works is its implicit connection to the Polish language, which tends to stress the penultimate syllable. And this is reflected in many of his pieces in the sense that his cadences, in musical terms, cadence are these points where you finish off the individual musical phrases. His cadences tend to coincide on the weaker beats of the measure instead of the strong beat of the measure. So there's that interesting connection with the Polish language. As a national of Poland living in a foreign country, his music became an ideal conduit for Polish culture and identity, to a point that the Nazis actually had to ban his music during World War II. As one surveys the wide variety of music that Chopin has produced over the relatively short span of his life, one begins to realize that quite a number of these pieces actually is a reflection of his nostalgia towards his homeland, Poland. I will now attempt to illustrate this with excerpts from 6 pieces I've selected, which I will demonstrate for you. While it would be very far-fetched to say conclusively that all of his music illustrates his sorrow associated with his homesickness, but the fact that he missed Poland a lot is an undisputed fact. As composers and performers, we tend to perform and compose the way we feel at the moment. When we are involved in music making, it is extremely difficult to conceal our true emotions. So I therefore speculate that it is entirely possible that Chopin wrote all of his pieces without realizing that his intense longing for his homeland became permanently crystallized in the forms of countless notes on the page. The first example I'm going to be demonstrating for you is the Mazurka in A minor, opus 17, number 4. The Mazurka is a Polish dance in triple meter, which again, like what we've said about the Polish language, which tends to stress the penultimate syllable, this particular genre tends to stress on the weaker beats of the measure. So we're talking about beats 2 and 3 instead of beat 1. The effects of this is actually very refreshing because we are not expecting the stress to fall on the weaker beats. So he's essentially equalizing all the beats, giving it a very floaty quality that we don't really know where we are in the music. Chopin's biographer, James Huneker, said this about his Mazurkas: "No compositions are so Chopin-ish than the Mazurkas. Ironical, sad, sweet, joyous, morbid, sane, and dreamy. They illustrate what was said about their composer. His heart is sad, but his mind is happy." The conflicting qualities of his Mazurkas perhaps is an illustration of his life in Paris. While he did enjoy the fame and recognition he received, a part of his heart will always be firmly entrenched in Poland. In this particular piece, we really hear a sense of nostalgia as Chopin recalls the music of his homeland. I wanted to just point you to two interesting places in this particular piece. In the very beginning, he indicates pianissimo, which is extremely soft. As if that wasn't enough, he indicates sottovoce, which in Italian means in an undervoice. So he almost wants the music to come out of nowhere, to just float in. And plus, the music starts on a weak beat, B2. So it's as if Chopin is trying to communicate something that's very deep in his heart, something that's very intimate, difficult to get it out in words. Measure 9, 10, 11, and 12, we have something that's very, very curious in music, in the fact that we have a chromatic descending line in the right hand, at the same time, in the left hand, we also have a chromatic descending line. Together, in music, composers will typically use a chromatic descending line to illustrate pain and suffering. So perhaps in this particular case, we could see that perhaps Chopin is just, he knew that he would never be able to return to Poland, and that thought probably gave him a lot of suffering and pain. The next piece I'll be playing for you is the Prelude Opus 28, number 4 in E minor. A prelude usually denotes a piece that serves as an introduction to something else that follows. But in Chopin's case, this is not the issue here. The issue here is that his preludes are actually self-contained, self-sufficient pieces that don't really need to introduce anything else. The interesting thing about some of his preludes is that some of them are extremely short, with some lasting only as long as 30 seconds. Chopin's preludes contain a wide variety of characters and tempi, and it is customary actually for some pianists to perform all 24 of them as a set, which would take about 40 minutes to do so. This particular prelude in the key of E minor conveys an ever-present sense of desolation and pain. And then he repeats that theme in the beginning. I also wanted to point you to a very interesting thing that happens in the right hand at the very beginning. We have this in the right hand. The insistence of that chromatic interval between B and C, first of all, it's chromatic, so therefore we have that reference to pain and suffering again. And also, it's as if Chopin is struggling to get the music to go beyond C. He tries and tries, but of course he fails. And the music actually falls all the way down to F sharp. In the left hand, again, we have the individual voices. This is a 3-note chord with individual voices that will always move chromatically, gradually and sequentially down. So this is the first chord, next chord, the bottom voice moves down half step, and then the top voice, and then the bottom voice. Sometimes the middle voices move. So the effect of this, again, creates a kind of just agonizing pain that persists. And also the fact that these chords are repeating, it's as if the music is a painful reminder of the fact that the pain will always be there. It will never go away. So this is a really good and effective use of chromaticism in that particular piece as well. The next piece I'll be demonstrating is Chopin's Nocturne in C sharp minor. Nocturnes are commonly known as night music, and this particular genre was cultivated by the Irish composer John Field. And this genre of music is basically characterized by a very melodic right hand plus an arpeggiated broken chord accompaniment in the left hand. This particular nocturne is one of the most popular amongst pianists and was published after Chopin's death. As the piece suggests, as the title suggests, nocturnes are pieces that evoke the mood and atmosphere of the night. Again, in this particular piece, we hear Chopin's penchant for a kind of melody that is achingly beautiful with a tinge of sadness. The next piece, Ballade Number 1, Opus 23 in G minor. Chopin was one of the first ones to actually apply this genre to purely instrumental music. Out of the many smaller character pieces that he's produced over the short span of his life, these ballades are sort of an anomaly in that they're extended compositions which features a strong sense of storytelling. The 4 ballades he composed are among some of the most demanding music, both technically and musically. In this particular ballade, we have a 5-measure opening introduction, which rises all the way from the low C octave all the way 3 octaves up. So the sound of this intro actually sounds like a very bold and assertive statement, almost like a proclamation. But you'll notice that as soon as it reaches to that top note, it keeps falling and keeps falling, almost in a sense of a very resigned manner. After the brief intro, we head into the primary section, which is in G minor, and again, we get that very distinct aura of melancholy. So even though the principal theme is in the key of G minor and the whole thing sounds very depressed, he does give us a glimmer of hope, very briefly, as he tries to nudge the piece in a major key. Right there. Of course, but it was fleeting. Then we slip right back into the depressed mood of the opening. The next piece I'll be demonstrating for you is the Etude Opus 10, number 12, otherwise known as the Revolutionary Etude. Chopin indicates fast with fire, energetically with force, and passionate. So with these indications, Chopin leaves no doubt as to how he wants this particular piece to be played and received. Etudes are known as studies, pieces that are written to target specific techniques. Chopin produced 2 sets of etudes, Opus 10 and Opus 25, with 12 in each set, totaling 24. Chopin's etudes are special in the sense that they're not really the dry and mechanical exercises that you would tend to expect in this particular genre. While many of them are, of course, incredibly difficult technically, they're known for their deep musical content and poetic qualities. This particular etude was written in 1831, around the time of the November Uprising. As you talked about in Chopin's life, that was around the time that the Polish revolt had started against the Russians. Of course, he could not go back to fight for his country, so instead he pours all of his passion and all of his feelings into this particular etude. In the opening of this etude, we have these screaming right-hand chords as if it's an outcry. And together with the rushing figures in the left hand, I think really aptly suits this title. So you could really hear that passion, that aspect of revolution, how Chopin just, because he had no choice to return, that was the only way that he could show the world how much he wanted to be back to his homeland. The last piece I'll be illustrating is the Polonaise Opus 53 in A-flat major. Unlike the Mazurka, which was a peasant dance, these Polonaises actually have a more noble origin. It's actually more dignified, it's more stately, and it was actually used for royal functions between the 17th and 19th century. This particular Polonaise is nicknamed Heroic and remains one of the most popular Polonaises he's ever composed. The interesting thing here is these Polonaises represent a very different medium through which Chopin channels his feeling for his homeland. Here we really see an overt sense of patriotism coming through the notes. So you see, there is a huge contrast between this kind of music versus the very opening piece I've showed you is very introspective and intimate. So this is yet another way Chopin channels his feelings for his homeland. The degree to which Chopin discloses his homesickness through his music is perhaps a matter of intense debate and subjective opinion, and perhaps only those who have had close associations with the composer himself will ever have the affirmative answer to this question. Nevertheless, I think as musicians, we should at least become curious about this significant move that he made from Poland to Paris at that very critical point in his artistic career, because this particular knowledge may influence the way a performer might interpret his music. 20 years after I left my homeland of Taiwan, I came to the stark realization that had I never left, I would not be the same person I am today. I remember the first few years after I arrived in Canada, how much I just wanted to be back home. I didn't want to move away. I didn't want to be on the other side of the Pacific Ocean. However, I think God has been really faithful, and He opened many doors and opportunities for me to prepare me for this career, to be an instructor at the collegiate level. Moving away from Taiwan at that point was very painful and was very difficult. But it inevitably added depth to the way I play music, because now I could genuinely feel and express the essence of many of Chopin's music as someone who has gone through a very similar experience moving away from home. In some ways, Chopin's decision to leave his homeland forever enriched the musical world. It is difficult for us to imagine a world without his piano pieces. His longing for Poland had resulted in some of the most timeless pieces being written, a body of music that will forever be cherished, and for that, we should be eternally grateful.